Recently, Marvel has been getting a lot of flack for releasing some, bad movies. And this got me thinking, were they ever actually good? Or was the hype around them just so intense that they seemed good? To answer this question, I did what any normal person would do. Watched all 35 Marvel movies in 7 days and ranked them. And here we are. The ranking system goes from S+ to F. I feel like the ranks are pretty self-explanatory, but I'll explain them throughout the video as well. So let's get started with the movie that started it all, Iron Man. And I gotta be honest, this movie is so sick. It did everything it needed to do. It introduced a lovable and interesting character, established the existence of a larger MCU, and was still entertaining and fun. It simultaneously set up the rest of the Marvel Universe for success while also being a great standalone movie. It does a perfect job of establishing Tony's character from the very first scenes and also shows why he built the Iron Man suit in the first place. Watching him collaborate with the Ensign was really cool and felt surprisingly deep for a sequence that lasted maybe 30 minutes. The escape sequence was also great. It almost felt like a horror movie, just brutal carnage, but in the best way. By far my favorite part of this movie though was the suit building process. Seeing Tony's thought process and how it evolved from the monster he built in the cave to the first Iron Man suit was so engaging to me. And I thought it was also a great way to show Tony as a character and how his kidnapping changed him. The humor throughout the movie was also great. Funny, but not too funny, you know? Quippy, but not over the top. Although I do gotta say, I was a bit caught off guard seeing Gwyneth Paltrow there. Kind of forgot she existed outside of her goop escapades. With all that being said, there were a couple of things I wasn't a huge fan of, mainly in the third act, which felt very rushed. The amount of time between learning that Obadiah betrayed Tony and the end of the movie feels very condensed for the amount of stuff that had to happen, especially compared to the smoothness of the first two acts, which felt very fleshed out and very well paced. This led to the third act feeling jumpy and all over the place, like when Obadiah just appeared in Tony's house when he was just across the country a scene before. Talk about a rough transition to follow. I also found the fighting in the final battle to be hard to follow as well, because it was so dark and the camera cut so quickly. But when the action was readable, it was very well choreographed and fun to watch. Despite these flaws, I still think it's a great movie and a great start to the MCU. I'm putting Iron Man in S tier, not because it's necessarily a perfect movie, but because it's a great movie and it's so important to the greater MCU. I'm not sure there's a single other Phase 1 film that would have been as good to start on, and that's very important when trying to establish a huge franchise like this. And let me tell you, it was way better than the next movie to be released, The Incredible Hulk. Hulk surprisingly came out in the same year as Iron Man, and it is just... it's awful. It is by far the worst movie that we're gonna see in the MCU for a while. This movie was like a fever dream, and there were so many issues it's hard to pick one to start on. I guess let's start with the acting. I don't plan on criticizing acting too much in this video because I don't want to be rude to the actors who put a lot of work into these movies regardless of the quality. But man, the acting in this movie was abysmal. The actor behind Bruce did a worse acting job than some high school theater kids, and Betty wasn't much better. It's crazy too because the actor behind Bruce has 4 Oscar nominations, so it's not like he's a bad actor. This was just a terrible performance, which I think is also a reflection of just how clunky the dialogue was in this movie. Really, the only character whose performance I enjoyed outright was the weird scientist, because he did a great job at being a weird scientist. An issue that might be even bigger than the acting though is the plot, which is just weird. There are so many bizarre and outright dumb moments in this movie, but the one that really sets the tone for this movie was the factory scene, where Bruce gets cut and panics because he needs to clean up his blood because it's all hulked out. He makes a huge deal out of finding the drop of blood on the conveyor belt and gives a huge sigh of relief once he's cleaned it up, only for the shot to then pan over to a blob of ketchup red blood clearly on a bottle. Like, how did this dude, who's supposed to be super smart, miss this? Another example is this moment later on in the movie, when Betty reveals she's willing to sell a necklace to get them money. It's supposed to be important to her, but it's not important to us, the audience, because we never see it before this moment. And then there's the end of the movie, where the final conflict kind of just peters out and the movie ends literally 1 minute later, leaving us with so many questions and just not being a fulfilling conclusion in any way. They also kept giving Hulk weapons. Who gives Hulk weapons in his debut movie? It's the Hulk. He smashes. He doesn't need car boxing gloves or whatever this was. By the time this movie ended, I was left dumbfounded and confused. It was an undeniably awful movie from the top to the bottom. but there was one aspect I really liked. That was the body horror. It's not common for a Marvel movie to do this kind of visual effects, and I think it's done pretty effectively here. So I just wanted to give credit where credit is due and say that there is at least one thing about this movie that is not terrible. But on its own, it's not nearly enough to redeem the movie. This is, without a doubt, an F-tier movie. I don't think there are any changes that could be made to this movie to make it a good or even decent movie. It would need to be completely rebuilt from the ground up, and that is the standard of terribleness that is required for a movie to get the F tier. Just irredeemably bad. So I'm glad they reworked Hulk in future movies, even if they still messed up his character. Anyway, back to Iron Man for the second movie in the trilogy. I don't know if it's just because I watched Iron Man 2 right after watching the Hulk movie, but I found it to be rather enjoyable. Was it as good as the first? No. Not at all, but there were a few things that I enjoyed about it. First of all, I was happily surprised by the amount of subtle critiques of American capitalism. Tony's idea of privatizing world peace is something that feels so quintessentially American, you know, with our love for privatizing important services. Also, Ivan's line of "a line of thieves and butchers" could be easily interpreted as billionaires, and his reaction to the hammer treatment showed just how insane rich people culture can be. There was also that moment at the race where everyone rushed to go see the action only to record it with their phones, which I think was some social commentary as well. There were also a lot of action sequences and sequences in general that I enjoyed, like the aforementioned race fight, which has my favorite suit up of the entire series. The introduction of Black Widow was also great, and the way she contrasted with Happy was pretty funny. I also found it interesting how S.H.I.E.L.D.'s operations have changed between the first movie and this one. It's just cool to see the real-time evolution of this organization. Now, with all that praise, I do have one major issue with this movie, which is the villains. While I like Ivan's character, I don't love it. I find him to feel really one-dimensional and underdeveloped, mostly due to the fact that there is another villain, and that one, Justin Hammer, is so annoying, and not in the way you want a villain to be. He's like the MCU's Elon Musk, just annoying, arrogant, unfunny, uncool, and desperate to be liked, which is ironic since Elon did make a cameo in this movie. I forgot this cameo was in this movie, and when it came on screen, it took me out for a second. I have an idea for an electric jet. Bitch, shut up. Even in 2010 you were cringe. I also wasn't a huge fan of the final climax. It just felt kind of, well, anticlimactic. I don't know, it just felt kind of sudden and underwhelming. I'm gonna give this movie a B tier because it wasn't bad and I did find it enjoyable, but it does still leave a lot to be desired. Next is Thor, and before we get too far into breaking down this movie, I just have to say, Natalie Portman is way too good of an actress to be in this movie. Her acting abilities are on another level compared to the rest of the cast, and that's not to belittle the other actors, she's just goated. Now, onto the actual movie, I liked it. I really like character-driven stories where the protagonist has a very clear arc and goal. They're kind of like candy to me, enjoyable and don't require that much thought. And that's exactly what this movie is. To me, Thor was annoying at the beginning of the movie and not annoying at the end, so mission accomplished. But I do wish it was more progressive rather than just an instant switch, which is what it felt like after his turnaround. I also liked a lot of the side characters as well, like the intern, whose sense of humor sent me cackling throughout the entire first third of the movie. But this also means that as she was less important to the movie, I also kind of enjoyed the movie less. In fact, I think that's the exact right way to describe this movie. While I did enjoy it all the way through, my enjoyment waned as the movie went on. To me, it started out great and ended kind of meh. I wasn't a huge fan of Thor's self-sacrifice scene, as it felt really padded even though it was obvious he would survive. I also wasn't a huge fan of Loki's character development either. It's not the fact that he turned evil that I don't like, more so that it felt like he became just evil. Like the whole first act of the movie, before it was revealed he was an ice giant, he felt like a really tricky and crafty character, worthy of his name. But afterwards, he felt just kind of evil and less complex. Look, I get it. If I was told that my dad had been lying to me for thousands of years, I would probably get pretty mad too. But Loki is supposed to be the trickster god, and it felt like there was a stark lack of trickery coming from him. I also kind of wish there was less time spent on Thor's friends, as they're pretty minor characters in this movie, and they only become less important as the Thor movies go on. So overall, I think I'd have to put the first Thor movie in B tier. It was enjoyable to watch, but I wouldn't say it really stood out in any meaningful way. Captain America. I was not a huge fan of this movie. I don't know if this is controversial to say or not, but it's the truth. It wasn't an outright bad movie, don't get me wrong. The movie was well constructed from a plot and concept perspective, even if it was pretty basic. It felt more like a standard action movie than a Marvel movie, you know? Like you could have told me this was a Mission Impossible or James Bond movie and I would have believed you. But this is part of the problem. It just feels generic, just basic and one-dimensional. It lacked depth, and I also wasn't a huge fan of any of the characters. Well, except Bucky, but he didn't last long in this film. Everyone else just felt, once again, basic. Very one-dimensional, very shallow, and this is especially true for Captain America himself, which isn't really something you want from a major character in a movie. Really, his only characteristics are that he's a good-hearted guy who hates bullies and can fight all day. I know he's supposed to be a more simple and straightforward good guy, but I got tired of his plucky attitude like an hour into the movie. I also feel like he had less voice lines than any of the other protagonists so far. I'm sure this was done because he's more of a doer than a talker, but it made it hard to get to know him or feel deeply connected to him, which is really important for a first movie. Even the villain, Red Skull, is simplistic. He was just evil. That's it. Although I do have to say, I find the Hydra salute hilarious. It's like whoever made it up thought, we need to make sure the audience really knows these guys are evil. So let's make them do the Nazi salute, but with 2 hands. When in reality, it just looks like they're looking for uppies. But aside from the character issues, plot issues, and depth issues, the movie is pretty solid. I'm gonna put it in C tier because it was just kind of It wasn't bad, but it wasn't particularly enjoyable either. And that brings us to our first Avengers movie, one of the biggest and most ambitious movie crossovers at the time. And honestly, they did a great job with it. This movie, much like Iron Man 1, is a movie that had to be good in order to secure the future of the MCU, and it definitely delivered. It's just plain fun from start to end. Watching the characters get to know each other and seeing how their diverse and unique personalities mesh and clash was so fun to watch, and so well executed. My favorite dynamics were definitely Steve and Tony for their stubborn opposing beliefs, and Black Widow and Hawkeye for pretty much the opposite reason. The redesign and recasting of Hulk also makes his characters so much more palatable and just outright interesting. But to me, one of the more underrated aspects of this movie is using Loki as a villain. To me, this is a great decision. Using a villain that is already well established in the MCU rather than trying to introduce a new threat reduces the amount of work the movie has to do to get the audience to understand the villain. And additionally, Loki specifically also works great because he is a character that is very well known outside of the MCU thanks to his origin in real-life Norse mythology. So even people who have never seen a Marvel movie might still be familiar with the villain in it. This allows the movie to focus more on protagonist interactions, which I think is what really makes this movie shine. That being said, I did have a few issues with it. First of all, I think it just lacked a bit of depth. The conflict was super surface level, and compared to the other Phase 1 movies, I think the plot was overall pretty surface level as well. I think this was done on purpose so the movie could focus more on forming the Avengers, so I'm not too mad about it. But a little bit more meaning instead of flash behind the movie would have been nice. Additionally, I did get a bit sick of all the quippy Marvel humor in this movie. I think this is the result of having so many funny characters in one room, which made this style of humor feel a bit more overdone than in other movies. But really, these are more of nitpicks than huge fundamental issues with the movie. Also, not important, but this team comp kinda sucks. No support plus Black Widow, no wonder they struggled so much. Next time, they gotta add a healer or two. Those are really the only issues I have with the movie though, so it gets a solid A tier from me, and it was a great way to cap off Phase 1. Meaning we're moving into Phase 2 with the conclusion of the Iron Man trilogy. This movie is a bit of a mess. I think there are a lot of good ideas presented in this movie, but the way they are executed is mid. Like the whole PTSD aspect of the movie. I'm glad it's there and it makes sense considering what Tony went through, but I think the execution was unrealistic and the healing process was rushed. I understand why the healing process was done the way it was done, but still. Also, I was not a fan of Pepper's response to it. You're really gonna abandon your man when he's obviously struggling with something? Talk about unsupportive. I also wasn't a fan of the villain. He wasn't outright bad, he just felt like a bit of an afterthought. He was only there like half the time, and it felt like he was kind of forced into the movie. I felt like his motivations were pretty weak as well, and I think he was too similar to Hammer from Iron Man 2, both as a character and like physically the actor. But there was one aspect that I think has aged phenomenally: the corrupt US leadership. Back in 2012, this felt a bit far-fetched, but now it's pretty believable. I also really enjoyed the Model 42 gimmick, and I felt like it led to some of the coolest choreography in the Iron Man movies. But the best part of this movie, to me, was undoubtedly the kid from Tennessee. I don't know why, he just kind of stole the show for me. Overall, the movie was fine. I found the watch enjoyable despite the issues the movie had. The good outweighed the bad just by enough to keep it out of C tier, landing it at the bottom of B tier. I wish I could say that for the next movie too, but I can't because it's Thor: The Dark World. Before we get into it though, I need to make a disclaimer. I did not have subtitles for the Dark Elf shit. The service I used just kept saying speaking Dark Elf, which wasn't exactly helpful, so I definitely missed part of the plot, but I got the overall gist. Dude is evil and wants to plunge the 9 realms into darkness because he's evil or whatever. With that out of the way, this movie is not good. There are so many issues with this movie from a construction point of view, but the biggest issue for me personally is that it's just boring. I just didn't find it engaging at all. Maybe this is partially because of my subtitle issue, but I feel like it just wasn't for me. I don't think the stakes really felt real in this movie either, just because a lot of what happens is so inconsequential. And there were also a lot of moments that just kind of confused me from a decision-making standpoint, like Heimdall's shield. That shit lasted less time than I do on an average night. It was up for like 1 minute. What was the point of that? Then there's Frigga's death, which felt like such a huge missed opportunity. Not only was the execution poor, as the music and the moment were completely out of sync and the death felt so rushed, but as we know now, this moment is super important to the later MCU. Yet in this movie, it feels like Thor barely cared that his mother died. This could have been a huge opportunity to show vulnerability in Thor, and while we do see some vulnerability in later movies, I think it would have made this moment so much more meaningful. I also think a lot of the earthly characters were kind of forced into this movie, if that makes sense. Like, this issue so obviously outscales Earth in terms of importance, right? So why force so many humans into this story? They could have gone the Ragnarok route with it and omitted Earth completely, and I think that would have made it a more succinct story. But instead, we got a bunch of characters that felt shoehorned into this conflict, like Ian, who I legitimately forgot about 3 times. I also don't like how stupid the villain is in this movie. He is capable of wielding the reality stone. He's obviously powerful, and all he does with it is make these weird spike things. Is he an idiot? We see what the reality stone can do, and it's a lot more powerful than this. I try not to criticize these movies based on future movies because I don't think it's really fair, but in this case, it's just too egregious to ignore. All of these issues led to me just not enjoying this movie at all. Even Natalie Portman's phenomenal performance couldn't redeem this one for me, but I don't think it's quite as bad as Hulk, so I'm gonna put it in D tier. It is a bad movie, but I think the bones are somewhat salvageable, unlike Hulk. Luckily, the next movie is amazing. Captain America: Winter Soldier was the complete opposite for me. I loved this movie all the way through. Maybe it's partially because I watched it right after Thor: The Dark World, so my expectations were cratered, but regardless of the reason, I liked it. This movie was a series of high-intensity action sequences that were glued together by an interesting plot. But what I think made this movie so much more enjoyable for me is that it felt grounded in reality. Obviously, it's still a superhero movie, but compared to Thor, this is pretty grounded. Right from the opening sequence on the boat, I was engaged. The tone was correct, the choreography was tight, it was really enjoyable. And from there, it was just great moment after great moment. Steve's conversation with Peggy was both organic and heartbreaking. Nick Fury's death, even if it was a fake out, is how you do a character death, not Frigga. The decision to put Black Widow in a Captain America movie was also a great choice, as it's the perfect environment for her character and allows us to get to know her character more. The first fight between Cap and Bucky had some great choreography, maybe some of the best in the MCU so far, and all of these good moments were strung together by a relatable and troubling message. Trying to do the right thing is feeling harder than ever, because right is getting more and more confusing. While I wasn't a huge fan of the Secretary as an antagonist, I was a huge fan of the threat he created, an AI-based system to get rid of threats. This feels very real, especially in 2025, with companies like Palantir doing basically the same thing. This movie is a solid S tier. I enjoyed it start to finish, and I think its flaws are few and far between. Not too different from the Guardians of the Galaxy, which is the next movie we're going to cover. This movie was very enjoyable and entertaining. What really stands out to me is how this movie was able to introduce so many major characters and get us attached to all of them in such a short amount of time, something a future Marvel movie greatly struggles with. This is a sign of great character writing, and while every character is well written, my favorite would have to be Groot. He just steals the show for me. The novelty of a character like this can wear off quickly, but I think the physical actions and range of emotions this tree expressed makes him a really compelling character despite his lack of language. He's really well constructed, and that makes the "We Are Groot" moment so impactful. Like, even though I've seen this movie a couple of times now, it still makes me tear up. But as I said, the other characters are all great too. Even Chris Pratt does a great job at playing an asshole like Star-Lord, probably because he has so much experience being one. Another aspect that really stood out to me in this movie was, of course, the soundtrack. They did a great job of balancing the 80s music with traditional scoring, and I think it made the moments where the 80s music was used that much more effective. Although I do gotta say, the final dance battle feels a little bit unrealistic. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but if I was a fanatic inches away from achieving my goal, I wouldn't let some dude dancing distract me. You know? But hey, maybe that's just me. Plus, even with that issue, I still think it's the perfect climax for this movie. It was also nice to get properly introduced to Thanos in this movie as well, allowing us to start acquainting ourselves with this major villain pretty early, all things considered. I'm also super glad they made him less blue over the movies. I really don't have any complaints about this movie, so I'm gonna put it A tier. I know it might seem weird to put a movie with no complaints in A tier, but hear me out. While there were no parts of this movie that were bad, I do think it was slightly unpolished. An S-tier movie is a phenomenal movie, and while Guardians of the Galaxy was good, it just comes up a little bit short of S-tier for me. And if Guardians of the Galaxy is missing a little, Age of Ultron is missing a lot. Much like Iron Man 3, I think this movie has a lot of good ideas. It's the execution where it struggled. Let's start with my personal biggest issue, Ultron himself. Or themself. I don't know, do robots have gender? Regardless, I didn't really like the characterization of Ultron. It feels like they were written by two different people. There's the Ultron from his introduction, which is more dark, menacing, and cryptic. This one makes a couple of appearances throughout the movie, and it is my preferred part of the character. Maybe it's because this is how Ultron was introduced, so it's what I was expecting for the rest of the movie. Or maybe it's just because I hate the other version. The other side of Ultron feels like an evil Tony Stark in terms of quips and writing, and I just don't like it. I understand he's a product of Tony, so it makes sense for him to have some Tony in him, but switching between this sarcastic, kind of plucky, charismatic Ultron and this solemn and reflective Ultron just felt jarring and weird. I think this part also detracts from the overall threatening aura a villain should have. His introduction made him seem like a cold, calculating, evil AI, and then in the next scene, he's acting like this. I just don't get it, man. And it's not helped by the fact that Ultron is the Avengers villain we know the least about when they are the major villain. We knew Loki from Thor, as I stated earlier, and Thanos had been hinted at multiple times in other movies, so we had the general gist of how he would work. Plus, as we'll talk about soon, Infinity War was basically a Thanos movie, so we got plenty of time to understand him there too. Ultron, on the other hand, got this one movie and had that split personality thing going on, making it hard to get to know him as a villain and making it even harder to care about him as a villain. He was just uninteresting and poorly executed in my opinion, which is really bad when he's the main villain. Now, with that major issue out of the way, there were a few things I did like about this movie, like the new characters Wanda and Quicksilver. Both are interesting and cool, and while I think their turn from evil to good was a bit rushed, I don't hate how it happened. However, I wasn't a huge fan of Quicksilver's death. It felt like the movie was trying to make a huge deal out of this death, but we barely knew the guy for one movie, and for the majority of that movie, he was a villain. So it's not like we had a lot of time to get attached to him as a character, and he was kind of annoying when we did see him, yet they made it seem like some major character death, which it really didn't feel like. I am a big fan of Vision though. I think his introduction was really well done, and using Mjolnir as a method to gain instant trust was really clever, and tied back to that scene earlier in the movie. His final talk with Ultron was also rather enjoyable, as it felt kind of like a full circle moment, and I love his visual design as well. Another part I liked was the Hawkeye estate. It's clear at this point in the MCU that Hawkeye is kind of getting outscaled by the conflicts, right? Even in the first Avengers movie, it felt like he was just kind of there, so giving him a family to care about gives his character more meaning, as it raises the stakes for him quite a bit. I also really enjoyed the character interactions that took place during this segment, and it was a nice, brief moment of respite that allowed the movie to breathe a little. But even with those positives, I think they are undoubtedly outweighed by the negatives. I know there were a lot of production issues on this movie, but I don't think we can really use that as an excuse for a poor movie. So it's a very solid C-tier movie for me, and I can't give much better praise to our next movie, Ant-Man, either. I can't put my finger on exactly why I don't like this movie, but I just don't. I feel like up to this point, I've been good about presenting specific reasons for why I do or don't like a movie, but I just can't do that for this movie. The whole thing just felt off. So please, allow me to be unspecific for this one movie because I truly cannot put my finger on what it is that I don't like about it. I think the underlying issue for me was the tone. It just felt like it was all over the place. Humor was in places that didn't make sense, and it was overly serious in other places that also didn't make sense. Additionally, I felt like the tone switched so frequently that it got jarring as well, and I found the dialogue throughout the entire movie to be unnatural and just clunky. I also wasn't a huge fan of the villain for this movie either. Darren just felt so overly generic and not memorable at all. He's just another bald dude who's overly capitalistic and angry. We get it, it's another Jeff Bezos clone. Please give us something original next time. I just didn't enjoy this movie at all. I have to put it D tier, and I wish I had more concrete reasons for doing so. Regardless, let's move on to our next movie, Captain America: Civil War. This movie is peak. It's amazing. It's fire. It's beautiful in every way. This movie is one of the greatest Marvel movies ever made, potentially one of the greatest action movies ever, which I know is insane praise, but hear me out. Everything about it is so spectacularly well done, and the reason is the central focus of the movie, the moral conflict. I love when a piece of media considers the consequences of its actions. It feels like so often a fight will happen and destroy a city or kill some people, and then once the conflict is resolved, it's like nothing ever happened. All that death and destruction occurred in a bubble, and it doesn't really matter how much property damage or trauma it caused as long as the bad guy was defeated. So many series are guilty of this, and Marvel is usually one of the biggest offenders. But this movie bucks that trend perfectly, forcing the Avengers to come face to face with the consequences of their own actions, causing a divide between them that has been brewing ever since the first Avengers movie. Tony and Steve are, of course, at the center of this conflict, and it's so perfect for so many reasons. They are ideological opposites. Aside from wanting to protect people, they could not be more different, with Tony thinking about the greater good and fighting for long-term stability of Earth, and Steve being more concerned with helping people on an individual level and being able to do so at the drop of a hat. So of course, eventually they would find themselves on opposite sides of this issue. It was set in motion before they even knew the other existed, and it's been built up so well, leading to this exact movie. And the payoff is executed perfectly. The showdown at the airport is one of the coolest scenes in the entire MCU. It feels so alien for these heroes to be fighting each other. They're all friends and allies, or at least were, but now they're on opposite sides of this conflict. It's the kind of fight that feels a little uncomfortable in your stomach because you know, no matter what, a character you care about is probably gonna get hurt. And yet, at the same time, we know why it's happening. It's a fight that makes sense as much as it hurts. And it's cool as hell. Every sequence here is very well done, but I do have two critiques. First of all, team comp. Again, people, this is a 6v6 and no one's got a healer. Like, come on. Secondly, I wasn't a huge fan of Spider-Man's introduction here. I don't think it was outright bad, but I found him annoying more than funny, and his quips and style of humor were a bit underwhelming as well. I think part of the issue here is Paul Rudd is also in this scene, and he's a master of this style of humor. So having him and Tom Holland, who is a great actor in many ways, interacting so closely together really shined a not so great light on Tom's humor in this sequence. But aside from that, it was a great sequence with a surprisingly heartbreaking end. I didn't care too much about Rhodey as a character, but the way they went down was still sad. If there is one aspect of this movie that I am conflicted about, it's the main villain. On one hand, I find his motives to be very interesting, and they're a perfect fit for the larger theme of this movie. His idea that an empire destroyed from within cannot be rebuilt feels very relevant in the US right now too. So this is another movie that has aged like fine wine. But at the same time, I kind of wish this movie just revolved around the Sokovia Accords and their consequences. There was a lot of this movie where it felt like the main villain was an afterthought rather than the main villain. Like, I'm pretty sure there was a whole ass hour in the middle where he just didn't show up once. But on the other hand, his role in setting up the final conflict between Tony and Bucky and Steve was undeniable, and that conflict was also peak. You can tell right away that the stakes here are different from the airport. It's so much more serious, and it leads to one of the most tense fights in the MCU. This shot of the slow zoom during the 2v1 was so good. You could feel the tension burning as the zoom drew in, and it was one of the most effective moments of soundtracking in the entire MCU. It's truly a special moment that concludes the movie and the separation of the Avengers in a perfect way. Surely the mending of Steve and Tony's relationship will have just as much thought and time put into it as its destruction, right? right? And lastly, I don't think I can talk about this movie without talking about the introduction of Black Panther. I love this character. He has so much aura on the battlefield, and T'Challa as a character is also very compelling in this movie too. The choice to cast Chadwick here is another example of perfect casting in Marvel. May he rest in peace. We'll talk more about him and Black Panther in a little bit though. In case it wasn't obvious, this movie is our first S+ tier movie. The S tier is supposed to be the highest tier of praise that a Marvel movie can get from me, but there are a couple of movies that clearly go even further beyond that standard. And so the S+ tier has been created for these rare, coveted gems. The work that was put into making this movie work paid off phenomenally, and the third phase of the MCU is off to a great start. And that doesn't really let up for our next movie, Doctor Strange. Don't misunderstand me, this movie is not as good as Civil War, but it's still a good movie. In a way, this movie almost felt nostalgic at this point in my watch through. It reminded me a lot of the Phase 1 movies where the focus was on building up a new hero completely from scratch, and I really liked that. It felt like a return to a familiar concept, but with a lot learned from those movies in order to make this build-up sequence even better. It also includes one of the most important messages in a Marvel movie. A lot of these movies have some underlying message or lesson, and while I have glossed over most of them for the sake of brevity, I think this is one that a lot of people could stand to hear.
It's not about you.
In addition to the hero build-up aspect, the overarching plot also just works. It has good twists without becoming too convoluted, and it's backed up by a pretty good cast as well. Mads Mikkelsen is always fun to watch, even if his character is a bit simplistic this time around. And Benny did a great job with Doctor Strange as well, likely from his experience with playing super smart assholes in the past. The most notable aspect of this movie to most people is probably the mind-bending visual effects, and I gotta say, while they do work very well, I feel like this is the first Marvel movie that leans a little bit too much on spectacle to create appeal. It's not a major issue here, but it becomes one later on in the MCU. One scene I do want to highlight before we get into some of the other minor issues is the final fight between Strange and Dormammu. I love this sequence. It's such a unique way to end a conflict in a Marvel movie. So often the final battle is this grandiose, destructive showdown, and I really liked this change of pace. It showcased not only the knowledge and brainpower of Doctor Strange, but also just how broken an Infinity Stone can be. Overall, I thought it was a very good climax to this movie. Now, I do have a couple of gripes. I don't have any major issues with this movie, but I do kind of wish we got to see more of the magic system. I know there were time constraints with this being a movie, but I think explaining it more to the audience would allow us to better understand what's going on beyond cool visual effects. And it would also help establish more limitations and potential loopholes, which I think are part of what elevates a magic system from good to great. Also, this movie was too dark. Like literally, why did everything have to happen at night? And even if it did have to happen at night, boost the brightness a little bit. It would have made every scene easier to follow. Other than that though, I don't really have anything negative to say. This movie is a very solid A-tier movie for me. While it doesn't really have any major flaws, I also feel like it doesn't excel at anything in a way that would elevate it to the S tier. Kind of similar to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1, which was way better than the second volume, which we are going to be talking about now. This movie was pretty mediocre for me. You know how I just said Doctor Strange might have relied a little bit too much on visual spectacle? Well, this one relies way too much on it. So many random rainbows and crazy space visuals, not to mention Ego's planet too. It felt like this movie was compensating for something with over-the-top visual effects. And let me tell you, it definitely was. I don't know what happened to Chris Pratt in this movie, but his performance was lacking, to say the least. It felt like none of his lines were genuine, and frankly, he didn't feel invested in the role either. This really affected the quality of the main plot, since he was, you know, the main character. And this wasn't helped by how mediocre Ego was as a villain either. He just felt so generic. Evil parent is evil, and he secretly wants to destroy everything the child loves for their own benefit. It feels so overdone and predictable at this point, and with these two being the driving force behind the main plot, it led to a lot of the movie feeling lackluster. It's really one of those movies where everything except the main plot is good, because boy did I love all of the side stories. The whole Nebula and Gamora plotline was engaging and felt thoroughly constructed. It made sense for them, and the resolution was heartfelt and came across as genuine. The connection between Rocket and Yondu was also a very interesting dynamic that worked surprisingly well. It's not that I thought these two wouldn't get along, I'm just surprised by how natural it felt. And I'm also surprised how natural all of Drax and Mantis's interactions felt too. But unfortunately, those three examples are kind of all I like about this movie. One aspect of this movie that I found to be a major downgrade was the use of 80s music. In Volume 1, 80s music was used on really special occasions. It was a rare treat, and it made the scenes it was used in feel more effective and unique as a result. This movie, though, I think they're overused. It feels like they're trying to create a similar effect to the original, but by using 80s music much more frequently, it dilutes the effectiveness of the usage. It doesn't feel nearly as special to hear these songs as it did in the first movie, and a byproduct of this is that it makes it feel like the scoring and soundtracking is lazy. I'm not saying that it is. I'm sure people worked really hard on it, but it feels like the attitude towards 80s music was less of let's use it to elevate this scene and more of this'll work. Earlier, I touched upon how this movie relies a little bit too much on spectacle, and while that is an issue on its own, I also think the CGI and visual effects overall have gotten worse too. It's not terrible, but things like Ego's Planet just don't look that good, and there are a few scenes where the lighting looks really weird too, which isn't a good thing when your movie relies on these aspects so much. My last major issue with this movie is the humor. I feel like it was a major step down from the first volume. There were still good funny moments, but the amount of jokes that just didn't land has increased for sure. And I also think this movie has the single worst joke in the entire MCU. When Rocket said,
"He says, welcome to the frickin' Guardians of the Galaxy." Only he didn't use frickin'.
I physically cringed. It was a painfully bad line. This movie overall is a notable step down from the first, in my opinion, so I'm going to have to put it in C tier. But our next movie, Thor Ragnarok, is without a doubt the best movie in its series. Thor Ragnarok is, in my opinion, what peak Marvel looks like. It's not the peak of the MCU, but peak Marvel nonetheless, if that makes sense. Everything about this movie was just clean and polished. Right off the bat, Jeff Goldblum is stealing the show. He's the perfect actor for a character like the Grand Master. Wacky and charismatic is his bread and butter, and I think part of what makes him so effective is how he interacts with people like Thor and Loki, who are also great in this movie, with Thor shining a bit more because, I mean, it's a Thor movie, of course he's gonna shine a bit more. I really liked his arc over the course of this movie. It feels like a real coming-of-age moment for him in regards to his home and his people. Although, I gotta say, if I hear Asgard as a people, not a place one more time, I'm gonna lose it. Hela was also a pretty good villain. Ragnarok is one of those movies that I don't think needs a villain like Hela outright, because so much of the movie revolves around escape from the Grandmaster and Hulk and Thor. But Cate Blanchett did a great job with this role, so I'm completely fine with it. To be honest, I wasn't a huge fan of Hela as a villain when this movie originally came out. I didn't find her to be super hateable, and my disdain for her was pretty low. But after season 0 of Marvel Rivals, I hate her. Her villainy is off the charts for me now, even if I'm not a huge fan of her headpiece in this movie. I just think it looks a bit clunky, sue me. I also love the notes of historical revisionism that she exposes, as it adds some depth to the history of Asgard, and also touches on how easy it is to write out bad parts of history. Another character that really makes this movie special is Hulk. This is the first time we really get to see Hulk as his own character and as an individual character. Hearing him talk about how he just wants to fight and live life as Hulk was pretty touching and interesting, even if I didn't like the weird auto-tune they gave his voice. It introduces a new angle into his and Bruce's relationship and makes Hulk a much more interesting character. This movie also has my favorite interpretation of alien planets in the MCU. There's something about the Grandmaster's planet that just feels real. Something about the city constructions and the colors chosen make it feel bizarrely Earth-like, yet also alien. It makes the whole environment feel refreshing compared to the usual Guardians of the Galaxy-esque space settings, which aren't bad, I just like this more. I also really enjoyed the climax of this movie too. It is somewhat unique and helps to drive home the message of the movie by destroying Asgard. It also has one of the sickest shots in the entire MCU. Like, I got literal chills from this moment. So good. There's really nothing bad about this movie in my opinion. I was engrossed and enjoyed it from top to bottom, so it's an easy S tier for me. I know it might be surprising to hear this is just S after all the praise I've sung, but we have to remember the S+ tier is for truly special movies. S tier is supposed to be the peak potential Marvel has, and I believe that Ragnarok is as perfect as it could be. The S+ tier is just for movies that go even beyond that. Next is potentially the most important film in the MCU, Black Panther. It is so rare that a movie that openly points out the systemic oppression of black people is made in general, and even rarer that it's done in a way that is palatable for white people. Black Panther did just that. It left little room for misinterpretation on the message it was sending, and it was an extremely effective message. This movie is chock full of commentary on colonization in general as well. It also really highlights Africa as a continent as well. A lot of the times that Africa is shown in Western movies and media, the focus is on how poor or how broken the continent is. But this movie does a great job not only highlighting the cultures of Africa, which were the inspiration for Wakanda, but it also does a great job at highlighting the natural beauty of the continent as well. At least that's what I've heard from people online. I'm a super white guy, so I don't know if it's really my place to speak on the importance this movie had on black culture, but I don't think I could talk about this movie without doing so in some capacity. Now, with that being said, let's talk about the movie itself. It was good. The central theme of isolationism versus colonialism was really interesting to me, and the way it punctuates scenes without being overly bearing like another movie's message is nice. I really like how this conflict manifests in T'Challa and Killmonger in their first fight. Also, this reveal is so sick. It does everything right. It relies on an established premise, it's done without dialogue, and it really makes Killmonger feel scary. It's just a great reveal in every way. In fact, this whole first showdown was great too, although I did find the mid-CGI backgrounds a little bit distracting. But honestly, from this moment on, I found the movie to be a little bit simplistic. I feel like not a lot of the characters got a ton of development, and a lot of them ended up feeling one-dimensional. I also had a really hard time engaging in the third act during the climax. Maybe it's because I already saw this movie before, but it just didn't feel super interesting to me. For the record, I've seen a lot of these movies already before, and a lot of their climaxes hit on rewatch, but not this one. If it wasn't for the social importance of this movie, I do not think it would be nearly as highly regarded as it is. I'm gonna give it an A tier. It was good, but I don't think it truly stands out all that well as a movie, especially not compared to the next movie, which is Infinity War. This movie slaps. I've seen this movie and Endgame at least 3 or 4 times, yet even on this rewatch, I was gripped from the intro like I was watching it for the first time in theaters. Every single second of this movie is so well done, so thought out, and so well connected to everything going on around it. There are 3 major storylines that make up the runtime of this movie: the Iron Man space story, the Vision rescue mission and subsequent battle for Wakanda, and Thor's quest for Stormbreaker and revenge. All 3 of these stories are well done and well executed. There isn't one storyline that feels like it's prioritized over the other, and no storyline feels neglected either. They're all given the time they need to be good, and that makes all of them succeed phenomenally. And throughout all 3 of these major storylines, there is a beautiful character-driven story from Thanos. There's no doubt that Infinity War is a Thanos movie more so than an Avengers movie. He's the character with the most screen time by a good margin, and it's his journey that ties all 3 major stories together. He's truly the main character. We watch him mourn, we watch him admire, and we witness his iron will, unbroken through it all. Yet despite learning to understand Thanos, he's still easily hateable because of how much he succeeds, and how much his success hurts the people we've been cheering for years now. This success is why Thor's story is probably my favorite protagonist's storyline. Don't get me wrong, they're all great as I said. Thor's is just my personal favorite. He lost so many people at the beginning of this movie, and he went through so much effort to craft a weapon to kill Thanos. Going across the universe, taking the full brunt of a star and almost dying in the process to make Stormbreaker, all in the name of vengeance, and all while still processing the loss of his people. And yet, he still failed to kill Thanos in the end. Talk about heartbreaking. Tony's story was heartbreaking too. This is exactly what he's been concerned about since Age of Ultron, and despite his best efforts, he wasn't able to prevent his biggest fear from manifesting, and it cost him his surrogate son. There was so much pain and anguish in this movie from the characters we love even before the snap. So much desperation for ultimately nothing. And yet, this movie ends on a plagal cadence in the score, which is far from a sad harmonic resolution. This cadence is also called the Amen cadence because it is frequently used in hymns, and I think the choice to use it here is really interesting. It might be being used as a soft conclusion to indicate that Thanos has accomplished his goal despite its implications, or it could be used to insinuate that Thanos' actions are akin to an act of God. I don't know why exactly it was used here, but I think it fits the tone of the ending perfectly. But enough of this depressing shit. Let's talk about the other part that makes this movie so good, the details of the characters. There are so many small moments that only work in this movie because of the themes and ideas that have been set up in prior movies. It was there in parts as important as Quill's reaction to Gamora's death, which was set up in Guardians Volume 2. And it was there in parts as unimportant as Rocket wanting Bucky's arm because he loves collecting prosthetic parts. There were so many moments like this throughout the movie, and they wouldn't have been possible without the efforts of the previous decade of films or the efforts from the directors and writers to familiarize themselves with the source material. So many moving parts had to align for this movie to work in the first place, let alone excel in any capacity. Yet somehow it excelled in pretty much every capacity. To me, this is without a doubt the peak of Marvel. While there are still a good number of enjoyable movies left at this point, none of them really come close to this peak. Not Spider-Man, not Shang Chi, and certainly not Endgame. But we have 2 more movies to talk about before we can get to that one. So let's talk about Ant-Man and the Wasp. It was okay, I guess. I don't know, maybe Ant-Man just isn't the series for me. I just can't really get into it for some reason. But this is definitely a step in the right direction from the first movie. The first major improvement in my eyes was the villain. Ghost was so much more interesting than Darren on her own, but I really liked the character of Ben Foster. He's not necessarily a villain, but it's so interesting how he wants to do the right thing and help Ghost, but not do anything too evil. He's like an evil centrist, if that makes sense. I also thought the fight choreography was really good too, and the characterization of Cassie helped me feel more connected to this movie than the first. Not that she wasn't in the first one, I just found her more endearing in this one. I think my biggest issue with this movie is I just don't find it to be memorable. Like, I took notes on this movie and everything to help jog my memory to write this script, and even with the notes I have, I just don't remember this movie at all. I remember like 5 scenes that I enjoyed, and that's it. So maybe it's a good sign that I don't remember the parts that I didn't like, you know? I don't know, I'll give it like a B tier. I think it was an enjoyable movie, it just wasn't a memorable one. Kind of like The Office. Next is Captain Marvel. I know a lot of people don't like this movie, and I thought it was okay. I'm not going to sit here and say it was amazing, but I don't think it was egregiously bad either. It had a lot of enjoyable moments, and I really liked how it threw us into a brand new conflict with characters we didn't even know. It felt like there was a degree of trust in the audience from Marvel that it doesn't usually give, and it helped grab my attention since I had to pay attention to understand what was going on. I liked the character of Captain Marvel as well at the beginning of this movie, so it had a pretty strong start in my opinion, and it was also super fun to see the S.H.I.E.L.D. guys in the 90s, especially Coulson, who I have missed a lot since his death. But as the movie went on, that's where issues start to arise. First of all, the turnaround of the plot felt really fast to me. Danvers went from trusting these guys completely to seeing the truth in a matter of seconds, it seemed, which just felt a bit unrealistic, even if it did make sense in the context of the movie. I'm just surprised she was able to betray everyone she trusted just like that, and she did so to support a race that she's been so conditioned to hate, and a race that is literally built to lie and manipulate. It just feels a bit unnatural to me. I also thought there were some moments where the acting left a bit to be desired. I think Brie Larson does a great job at playing this snarky, confident person, which works well for the majority of the movie, but I don't know if I can say that her performance was great during the emotional scenes. It could also be a writing or dialogue issue, but the crying just felt forced and not well performed. I also feel like the final act of the movie strayed a bit too far into power fantasy territory. I know Captain Marvel is supposed to be super strong, but it just felt like this was too much even for a superhero movie, which is kind of crazy to say. Overall, it was a fine movie. I don't think it was outright bad, but I'm not going to sit here and say it was particularly good either. So it gets C tier. And now we come to Endgame. To be clear, I don't think Endgame is an awful movie, but I do think it has some pretty major flaws. My biggest issue with the movie, by far, is how many long-term plot resolutions were just kind of brushed aside or done off-screen. Endgame is supposed to be the climax of the Infinity Saga, the final piece of the puzzle. A decade of building has all been leading up to this moment, and a ton of storylines need to be resolved here for it to feel complete. Yet somehow, they botched almost every every single one. Let's start with the most egregious and obvious storyline that was butchered, Hulk's story. Hulk has been a major piece of the Avengers pretty much since it started, and a lot of his growth centers on the relationship between Banner and Hulk. At first, we're led to believe that Hulk is just some monster that Banner needs to learn to control, but then in Ragnarok, we learn that Hulk is also a sentient being that wants to live life. So the relationship is not as simple as it looks, and it only gets more complex in Infinity War, where Hulk refuses to work with Banner after losing to Thanos despite multiple attempts to get him out. Their storyline leaves off here with Banner saying, "We have a lot to work on," insinuating that they're going to work together to figure something out. And then, in Endgame, it's just resolved, apparently done off-screen, and the solution being Bruce Banner controlling Hulk's body like a puppeteer with no sign of Hulk, the character Hulk, in there at all, just a husk to be piloted. It's just so disrespectful to the character of Hulk to brush him aside when we know he wants to live a life too. And the fact this resolution happened off screen makes it even worse. Then there's Tony and Steve's resolution. At the time of Endgame, these two have not seen eye to eye or been on the same team for like 8 years. They didn't speak from Civil War to Infinity War, and when they did finally speak again, it didn't exactly go well. There is clear animosity between these two, and it feels like there needs to be resolution with a conversation or a fight or something. The resolution should be a big deal. It's a conflict between the two lead heroes of the MCU, and yet it's resolved by a handshake, and that's pretty much it. They're buddy-buddy again just like that, like nothing ever happened. It just feels like a cheap resolution to such a massive conflict. Steve also annoys me in this movie in general. After a decade of his gung-ho attitude getting people hurt and killed, he's still so willing to take major risks. Has he learned nothing from his mistakes, and now he wants to mess with time, no less? It's just frustrating that every other character seems to have had growth and he really hasn't. Then there's Hawkeye's arc, which I don't even understand why they included it in the first place. I like the first scene with him losing his family. I think it's an extremely effective way to start the movie. But after that, he turns into a vigilante and retires as a vigilante within one scene. Why even give him this story at this point? Also, and this next complaint might just be a me issue because I haven't seen anyone else talk about this, but I do not like this new Thanos. I found him to be wholly and completely uninteresting, just generic as a villain. He just felt evil for no reason other than being Thanos. Infinity War Thanos felt like he was collecting the Infinity Stones to snap out of duty, right? It wasn't something he wanted to do, but he felt like it was necessary to save the universe. This Thanos feels like he wants to destroy the universe, not out of duty, but some other desire that is kind of ambiguous. Maybe revenge, maybe just ego? He's also a fundamentally different Thanos from Infinity War, right? He didn't kill the Asgardians, snap away half of this universe, kill Gamora. He isn't the Thanos that caused the cast so much strife and agony in the previous movie, and that also made it hard for me to care about him as much as an antagonist. It also annoyed me how the entire movie was basically kicked off by a mouse randomly running around the truck and letting Scott out. This really annoys me because it would have been so easy to set up another reason for him to get out. I don't like rewriting parts of movies usually because I don't think it's really my place, but I'm going to in this one instance because it's so obvious to me. In the post-credit scene of Ant-Man and the Wasp, have Hank mention that if something goes wrong, the machine will automatically spit Scott out in 5 hours. That's it. But that time is tracked in Scott's time, so 5 hours in the quantum realm, which is 5 years in real life. Bada bing, bada boom, literally just fixed. That's it. Literally one line would have removed one of the movie's biggest plot conveniences. My last issue with Endgame is that it felt like it leaned too much on fan service to make fans happy instead of making a substantive movie. Moments like Cap lifting Mjolnir and Tony talking to his own dad were used to keep fans engaged and happy, despite how lackluster the bones of this film are. It was like feeding the audience candy after candy to keep them happy, rather than a substantial and balanced meal. Candy is fun a couple of times throughout a movie, but in this movie, it was just everywhere all all the time. And when you take away the candy, you see the underlying issues, like the ones I've highlighted and plenty more. Now, with all that being said, I did still enjoy the movie as an overall experience. The part that stands out to me the most is the post-snap sequence prior to the 5 years later. There are a few reasons I like this sequence, but the one I want to highlight now is Nebula. She kind of stole the show for me here. Her interactions with Tony felt genuine and very human, and then her mourning Thanos after his death was also touching. He was her father after all. Thor's empty revenge was also great. He finally went for the head, but it's still not going to bring everyone back. Tony and Steve going at it was great too. It was just a bunch of well-constructed moments that worked well together. I also enjoyed the final battle a good bit, even if I did think it was a little bit long, but whatever. No matter how many times I see this movie, I always love watching Wanda tear apart Thanos. She looks so happy to be doing it and so thirsty for revenge. Surely this won't lead her down a dark path. The 3v1 against Thanos was also a great moment, and it showed how much these three have learned from each other over the course of the MCU. And, of course, everyone coming back to life was a great moment too. That should go without saying. And there were plenty of other enjoyable moments scattered throughout this movie too. If you just turn your brain off and don't put too much thought into this movie, it is plenty enjoyable, thanks to all the aforementioned candy. But I'm not here to do that. I'm here to give my thoughts on the movie after thinking about the movie. While I did enjoy this movie in some capacity, I don't think I enjoyed it enough to overlook the major issues. So I'm going to have to give Endgame a C tier. And now we move into phase 4. And boy, what went wrong here? So many bad movies, but let's start with a pretty good one. Spider-Man: Far From Home. Is this movie amazing? No. Is it as good as the first one? Also no, but it's still entertaining. I think the most impressive thing about this movie is how well it captures the convoluted nature of teenage romance, and also the awkwardness of it. It all felt really natural and well written. I also really liked the fight choreography as well, and Peter's overall character in the movie and watching him deal with Tony's death. I especially liked the suit building scene. It really felt like Peter was stepping into Tony's shoes in that moment. But if I can be honest, that's kind of all I liked about this movie. I did not like the villain. I found Mysterio to be pretty underwhelming, and I wasn't a huge fan of the acting for him either. It also felt like a lot of characters kind of got sidelined in this movie. Ned played a much smaller role in this movie than the other movies, and also the introduction of Brad was a weird choice too. Like, I know he was introduced as a love antagonist, but it put him in a place where he wasn't important enough to have a major role, so he just felt forgotten by the third act. There were also a lot of weird moments in the plot, like Peter trying out Stark Tech on the bus, which just feels reckless. Also, the whole student body somehow not seeing the drone or Peter jumping through the roof of the bus. Like, no way, dude. Someone would have noticed that. I also felt like Nick Fury was too mean in this movie. He's always been a pretty ornery guy, but here he just felt like an ass to Peter. I do have to say though, this guy's wife pretending to blip out had me cackling. It's such an insane thing to do, but it's also very believable. Overall, I don't think this movie was outright bad, but it definitely did not live up to the first or third movie. I think I'm gonna put it in C tier. Like I said, it's not bad, but there were enough issues that I didn't find it all that enjoyable. But even with its issues, it is still miles better than the next movie, Black Widow. This movie is ass in pretty much every way. There's a lot of issues to cover, but before we get into them, I just want to mention that this intro credit scene is way too long. I legitimately checked to see if I somehow skipped to the end of the movie because it just went on for so long. And honestly, that set the tone for the entire movie. First off, the mission they chose to center this movie on just feels so random. I know it was done to introduce Yelena and the guy from Stranger Things, but it feels like such a weird choice when the mission that made Natasha switch from evil to good is the obvious choice for a solo film. We already know nothing in this movie really matters in terms of stakes because Natasha literally cannot die. So instead, I think focusing on giving her an interesting origin story would have made a lot more sense than what we got. So I'm not really on board with the whole premise of the movie, but even if I was, I think I would still hate this movie because the movie itself is just awful. Let's start with the characterization of Natasha. It's not great. I know they were in a bit of a weird spot here because she's mostly a one-dimensional side character, and as such, she needed more complexity to stand as an interesting protagonist. I just don't think the way they did it aligns with the Natasha we know very well. The combat and action sequences are also just unbelievable. Every one of these Marvel movies requires a degree degree of suspended disbelief. But I could not suspend my disbelief for this movie. Black Widow is supposed to be a normal person physiologically, right? She doesn't have anything making her more durable or stronger as a human being. And yet, within the first hour of the movie, she walked away from 2 normally life-ending car crashes. That's just one example, but this kind of stuff happens all throughout the movie. I also feel like the animosity between Yelena and Natasha was pretty forced, as was the whole family coming together and working together on this mission. I just don't think it was set up really well. Also, you really expect me to believe that Dreykov has a flying base until 2016 and it was never detected by S.H.I.E.L.D. or Stark or anyone? Really? Also, a pheromone lock? That's so gross to me. Like, who thought that was a good idea? It's just weird. And obviously the CGI was bad too, but we already knew that, right? I don't know if there was a single moment in this movie that wasn't super convoluted or poorly written. It was just bad from top to bottom, and so it gets an F tier. Next, we have Shang Chi, and I gotta be honest, I think this movie is a little overrated. It was kind of hit or miss for me. There were some aspects that I thought were really good, and some aspects that I thought were pretty lackluster. Let's start with the good. This movie has amazing fight choreography. Despite there being a ton of fights in this movie, it never got old. Each one felt fresh and unique. My personal favorite was the first one. It felt so dancerly and light, but also pretty serious. I also loved the soundtrack. It did a great job of blending modern music with traditional Chinese music, and it was really refreshing compared to the usual orchestral music that accompanies Marvel movies. As for what I didn't like, it was pretty much everything else. I thought the plot was okay, but definitely generic. The dialogue was also super clunky, at least the English words were. I don't speak Mandarin, so I don't really know how the Chinese portions sounded, but they sounded fine to me, I guess. I was also confused by the role of the sister in this movie. There were times when it felt like she was completely sidelined, like in the escape sequence from their dad's compound, and also places where I felt like she was kind of shoehorned in, like the final fight. Also, the CGI is not good in this movie. I've seen better done fantastical monsters in Final Fantasy and Monster Hunter games, but the most egregious part of this movie, to me, was undoubtedly the obvious 10-minute long BMW commercial. It was the most blatant product placement I've seen outside of a Michael Bay movie. They didn't even try to hide it, and it felt like it was so out of place too. Like, you've got all these beautiful, fantastical, and serene backgrounds and a bright blue BMW plowing through them. It just completely broke my immersion. As much as I want to give this movie a high rating because of how beloved it is, I just can't. So many aspects fell flat for me, so I think I'm gonna have to put it C tier, which is the same tier I'm putting Eternals in too. Here's the thing about Eternals. It is a very ambitious movie, and it just comes up short in pretty much every way. It is hard to write a movie about 11 brand new characters and get the audience to care about them. That is a big task no matter the movie, and while they tried to remedy this by making Cersei a lead and also killing off 2 of the Eternals, the time spread between the characters made a lot of them feel undeveloped. I think this is the main underlying issue with the movie, because almost every other issue I have with it came from the characters. First and foremost, too much crying. I'm not usually someone who criticizes characters for crying or being emotional, but this is just too much. I'm pretty sure they spent more screen time crying in this film than they did fighting. It was just way too much, and because we didn't really care about these characters, the emotions didn't really mean anything to us, or at least to me. Also, I don't think we needed 4 different intertwined love interests, especially when they were all super undeveloped. I thought just the 1 or 2 were already kind of a lot, and they just kept adding them. Another part I didn't like was how much time they committed to Ajax's death. I know they were important to the Eternals, but did we really need to see everyone's reaction to it? I feel like we saw it so many times. I think the plot and concepts at the center of this movie are pretty solid, and the twist in the middle about the true purpose of the Earth was very well done to me. It's hard to set up an effective twist in a brand new world like this, but I think it was very well done. I also thought a lot of the action was well choreographed and felt unique because of all the different abilities being used. One of my favorite aspects was the general visual designs for the Eternals. Their uniforms and all those circly things just looked cool to me, but I don't think these aspects were enough to save it from the other issues it has, so it sits in C tier. Next is Spider-Man: No Way Home. There were a lot of things I enjoyed about this movie. However, one thing that I really did not like was the premise. The fact that this entire movie is set in motion by Doctor Strange failing a spell just feels lazy. Like, he's supposed to be one of the smartest and most adept sorcerers ever, and he didn't even think to ask Peter if there were any conditions he wanted in this spell. I just don't find that believable, especially for a spell this dangerous. Also, not that important, but while we're talking about the beginning of the movie, J.K. Simmons does a fire Alex Jones impression. Now, even if I don't like the premise of the movie, the ensuing adventure was really fun. Seeing all the past villains come out of the woodwork and return was very entertaining, and watching how they interacted was fun too. The standout was of course Willem Dafoe as the Green Goblin. Such a great performance, especially in that chilling hallway scene. I also thought Aunt May's death and its consequences were really well done. But once the other Spider-Men start coming into the picture, I feel like this movie falls a bit into the Endgame trap, meaning that it relies too much on fan service to be entertaining rather than making the actual story entertaining. Was it really fun to watch these three Spider-Mans interact and talk to each other? Yes, of course it was. And that rooftop scene where they were all mourning was really well done. But for me, that was kind of the only enjoyable part of the third act. I didn't find the climax to be all that interesting. It just felt a bit nonsensical. Although I did enjoy the resolution and ending to the movie. Peter having to essentially give up everything to make things normal again was a great form of sacrifice. And I think it puts the next movie in a very interesting spot, if they're making a next one. While this movie had its flaws, it was still enjoyable, so I'd give it a B tier. And now we enter Marvel's Dark Age. I think a lot of people have this idea that right after Endgame is when the MCU instantly got bad. But for me, I think it starts here. Sure, Black Widow was awful, but everything else was at least decent. Now though, there are like 2 good movies left. And let me tell you, Multiverse of Madness is not one of them. Let's start with the few things I liked about this movie. First of all, the horror aspects. I said way back in Hulk that body horror and horror aspects in general aren't super common in Marvel movies, but this movie bucks that trend. There are plenty of horrifying moments throughout this movie, and they're all pretty effective overall. The visual effects were pretty solid for the most part, and I also thought the performances from Olsen and Ben were solid too, even with the terrible dialogue they had to work with. Almost every single line in this movie feels awkward or out of place or just poorly written, to be blunt. It made this movie very hard to get into because in every scene I was just getting taken out by the poor dialogue. Also, not that important, but they say multiverse way too much in this movie. Within just the first half an hour, I was already tired of hearing that word. My biggest issue in this movie though is by far the magic. It felt like they were just making up what magic could do along the way. The power levels were inconsistent, the abilities available seemed to come and go, and it just felt like the magic became a cop-out for any situation, instead of being a tool to resolve situations, if that makes any sense. I also wasn't a fan of how America was treated as a character, or her name, but that's another issue. One of my biggest pet peeves in movies is when characters are used solely as a plot device. It's fine if they're sometimes used as one, because technically all characters are plot devices, but when it's their only job to be a plot device, it feels so lazy and leads to super undeveloped characters. They could have just made America some mystical pendant and the entire movie would have been the same. Why even have a character at that point? I also didn't like how the secret to her power was just believe in yourself rather than something a little bit less cliche. There was also the Illuminati sequence, which was also dumb. You're telling me the smartest man on Earth gave away the one method they had to beat Wanda? Really? And then Strange is essentially given these magic inhibiting handcuffs and he doesn't use them on Wanda? What a waste. Then there's the end of the movie where Wanda drops a mountain on her head. Talk about a forced resolution. This movie started out mid at best and just got worse and worse as it went on. It is an F tier for me. I don't think there's any way to save this movie without rewriting pretty much all of it. And the same goes for Thor: Love and Thunder. Right from the get-go, this movie felt weird. I don't know exactly why, but I was just confused by the sequence with the god and the new evil guy. I know they had to establish a new villain, but still. Honestly, I think a big part of why I didn't like this movie was that in the conclusion to Endgame, it is set up as if we're going to get a Thor x Guardians of the Galaxy crossover, which I was really excited for and set high expectations for me. And then they break up 15 minutes into this movie. It just felt misleading and was a pretty big letdown, especially since the sequence they were there for wasn't that good either. I also wasn't a huge fan of the characterization of Thor for almost the entire movie. I found him to be exceedingly annoying in almost every scene he was in, which isn't good for a Thor movie. Even depressed Endgame Thor felt better than this because he had a very good reason to be depressed. Then there was that long-ass, mid-ass reenactment of Ragnarok. Did this really have to be in the movie, it felt like it just wasted time and didn't need to be there at all. Also, the streaming goat bit was annoying within the first scene of its introduction, and we all know just how prevalent those goats were. Also, and this might be a nitpick, but I kind of wish Thor's promise to Mjolnir was set up in a prior movie. It just felt like a bit of retconning that could have been easily avoided, but it's not a huge deal. But the most unforgivable sequence in this movie, to me, was the black and white sequence. It just felt so poorly put together that it was hard to follow. Maybe this was done to make the sequence more mysterious, but I thought it just made it hard to follow. Also, what's with the tentacles? I haven't talked about it yet, but I feel like post-Endgame, there are so many more movies that have weird tentacle scenes in them. Why did they start doing this? I wouldn't mind if it was just like one movie, but the fact it happens in multiple movies just feels sus, you know? I also wasn't a huge fan of how convenient it was that the key to eternity was the Bifrost. Speaking of eternity, doesn't its existence kind of bring some plot holes into the equation? I feel like getting to eternity would be way less work than collecting the Infinity Stones, you know? Like, if this dude can figure out the path to eternity, I'm sure Thanos, with all of his resources, could have figured it out too. Also, it seemed like Thor knew about eternity before this movie started, so why didn't he think to use it to undo the snap? I don't know, it just feels a little short-sighted to me. This movie is just filled with issues from start to finish. Not even Natalie Portman's stellar acting could save it, although I do think it ended on a fairly high note. Thor seems like he will be a good father, all things considered, and I liked his interactions with the little girl. But that one high note doesn't redeem all of the low notes that preceded it. So this movie has to undoubtedly be another F tier. And now we come to Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. This movie was in a tough place, I'll say that. It's just not the same without Chadwick. They tried their best, but without him, I just struggled to care. I will say though, the funeral sequence and general representation of grieving was pretty good. I found them a lot more compelling and heartfelt than pretty much any other representation of these in the MCU. Aside from that, the movie was just okay. I think the initial concept is a bit weak. The fact that it all rests on Wakanda never looking for more vibranium doesn't really feel realistic to me. You're telling me that this super advanced civilization with a monopoly on this resource never once considered that there could be more vibranium on the ocean floor? That's just kind of crazy to me, especially considering how important the monopolization of that resource is for Wakanda. I also feel like this movie could have been worked out with slightly better diplomacy from both sides. I understand that for both Talokan and Wakanda, diplomacy is a pretty new concept, but still, watching Namor and the Queen talk was like watching two toddlers try to prevent a world war. I also didn't like the characterization of the Queen very much in this movie compared to the first. She just seems a lot more rash and unreasonable in this movie. Namor I also wasn't a huge fan of from a character perspective, but I do gotta say, he's pretty hot. I also love how developed his back is, not because I think it's hot, more so because swimming in general creates enormous backs like this. So it was just a nice detail. I also really like how he flies. It is both really cool and really terrifying. My favorite part of this movie though was Shuri's conversation with Killmonger. I wasn't expecting this at all, and I thought it was a pretty good twist, but I wasn't a huge fan of Shuri's overall characterization in this movie either. But I understand a lot of this movie is her processing her brother's death, so she's not going to be the same character we saw in the first Black Panther movie. Overall, the movie was okay. I don't think it excelled at all that much, but I also wouldn't say it's outright bad either. So another C tier. And next is Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. This movie was weird, but not good weird. Let's start with the biggest offender of this, MODOK. Who thought this was a good idea? This is some of the grossest, most awful CGI I have ever seen. Every single time he came on screen, I physically cringed because he just looks so gross. And he isn't a more interesting villain than in the first movie either. In fact, I think he's written much worse in this one. Another offender of weirdness is Hank's wife, who behaves so bizarrely through the first half of the film. I can understand her reservations about talking about the quantum realm when she is back on Earth. Telling these psychos about Kang probably would have made them more likely to try and go into the realm. But why not tell them about him once everyone is there? Like, at that point, you're hurting them more than helping them by not telling them. They should know about a guy that can vaporize them in a second and has destroyed who knows how many timelines. Kang himself also felt a bit weird. I know he was introduced to set up the now now-canceled Avengers movie, but I just found him to feel bland, and I thought he would be a lot more intense than he was. There were also some smaller issues I had with the movie not related to the weirdness, like Hope, who I feel played a really minor role in this movie, despite it being an Ant-Man and the Wasp movie. There was also the ants, which felt like such an ass pull. Oh, they just happened to fall into a time dilation? How convenient. Also, what happened to Hank's heart problems? Wasn't that the reason he couldn't become small anymore? Did those just disappear after a certain size or something? With all that being said, there were some solid moments. I thought a lot of the interactions between Scott and Cassie felt really genuine, and I think Cassie's characterization is pretty good too. Some of the weird new monsters were also lovable, which I was kind of surprised by. And I think the concept behind this movie was overall interesting. It was really the execution where it kind of fell apart. I think with some reworking on the characterization of Kang and the plot, this movie could actually be kind of good. It's never going to be like an S-tier movie, but I don't think it's irredeemable either. So I'm going to put it at the low end of D tier. Luckily, our next movie is much better. Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is a movie that kind of stole my heart. I wasn't expecting it to, but right from the start, I found it really interesting. It has such a different tone than the rest of the Guardians movies. It is so much more depressing, but I like that change of pace for this series. In fact, this whole movie was pretty emotional. Between Rocket's backstory and general condition, and also the Mantis and Gamora storylines, I found them all to be very effective. This is how you do an emotional Marvel movie, Eternals. It felt like every character in this movie grew in some capacity, and a lot of them also grew to know each other too. I found the High Evolutionary to be an interesting villain. His quest for perfection is twisted and horrible, but what makes him a great villain is that he thinks he's doing the right thing. Kind of like Adam Warlock, who I wasn't a huge fan of in this movie. I just felt like he was really immature and kind of annoying. Also, the fact that Adam is supposed to be the perfect human being and he's British, that's just not believable. I also really did not like the Lunchables ham planet. That was just gross. But what really makes this movie stand out to me is the ending. I think it's a very effective way to end the Guardians of the Galaxy, both literally and figuratively. It felt like everyone's character got an ending that made sense for them, and the dissolution of the Guardians felt like a natural next step for them. This is one of the best conclusions to a Marvel trilogy in the entire MCU, and I think it's a pretty good movie overall. It is an easy A tier for me. If only the Marvels was even close to being that good. This movie annoyed me, like just in general. The heroes, annoying. The villains, annoying. The plot, annoying. It was just infuriating to watch. The biggest contributor to this, in my opinion, was that the movie just expected us to go along with the story without really explaining any of it. Where did these super important bangles originally come from? Who is Dar Ben? Why does Earth have a space elevator now? I know I said in Captain Marvel I liked being thrown into the action, but the difference is that movie at least explained what was going on through subtext. This movie didn't even do that. Even 40 minutes into this movie, I still felt kind of lost, and it's only like an hour and a half long. I'm not usually a fan of info dumps, but I think one would have been helpful in this movie. Another major issue was the dialogue. It all felt like it was written by a high schooler attempting their first YouTube skit, although that could have also been an acting issue because I wasn't a huge fan of the performances in this movie either. Although I do have to say, Kamala's performance was pretty solid, even if I didn't really like her as a character. Everything she did just felt kind of cringe and awkward, and even though I thought it was a solid acting performance, I still felt myself not enjoying the scenes she was in. I also found the body switching gimmick to be poorly explained. It seems like on some occasions they don't switch when using their powers, and I don't know why that is. Though I should say, the switching does lead to some pretty cool choreography. In addition to these issues, I also found the plot to be a bit convenient. Like Goose just happening to lay eggs that allow everyone to get out of the space station. Convenient. Dar Ben's bangle being one of the few counters to Captain Marvel because it can drain energy. Convenient. Also, how is this woman gonna die? She went into the heart of a star and came out alive. That's crazy. In case it wasn't obvious, I was not a fan of this movie. I think it's pretty flawed even at its core, and it would take a lot of rewriting and reworking to make it any better. So it gets an F tier. And now we have the most recent Marvel movie, Wolverine and Deadpool. It was fine. This is one of those movies that's mostly made for people who are fans of both of these characters, right? Well, I'm not really a fan of either. In fact, I haven't seen another Deadpool or Wolverine movie outside of this one, so it definitely wasn't a movie made for my enjoyment. And I felt that from the very first scene. I just found Deadpool annoying more than funny. His quips felt very millennial, and I think his overall sexual metaphors were oftentimes poorly constructed. He also talks too much. I was tired of hearing his voice within the first hour of the movie. I actually think my disdain for Deadpool made me like Wolverine more than I was expecting. His gruff attitude was very refreshing compared to Deadpool's, and they contrasted very well with each other. I did find a lot of the fighting to be well done too. It felt different from typical Marvel choreography, and it was refreshing. My favorite fight was definitely the car fight. It was so fun that I didn't even care it was a 5-minute long car ad this time. The Chris Evans cameo was fun too, and the antagonist was pretty decent as well. And I think that's how I'd describe this movie overall. Decent. It wasn't amazing, but it wasn't poorly constructed either, so it's going at the bottom of B tier for me. And lastly, we have Spider-Man Homecoming. You might be wondering why this movie is at the end rather than in its chronological spot, and to be honest, I forgot to put it in my script when I recorded. I don't know how I forgot, but I did. So rather than try to insert it really awkwardly in its correct spot, I'm putting it at the end, because I think it flows better and it's the second easiest spot to find it. Anyway, with that out of the way, this is a great movie. In my rating of Civil War, I mentioned how I wasn't a huge fan of the introduction of Spider-Man because his humor felt a bit lackluster. Well, let me say that it is much improved. It was great in this movie. In fact, the dialogue in general was also great. It felt really organic and the banter between characters was believable and hilarious. I also liked how low stakes this movie was. It made the conflict more believable and also made it easier to connect with the characters involved. Obviously, the action was great too. Spider-Man is such a fun character to watch fight as he lends really well to fluid camera work, and that was used spectacularly throughout the film, especially for the ferry sequence. The supporting cast around Peter was also great, with Ned and MJ giving the perfect amount of comic relief throughout the movie. It is a great movie in pretty much every way, so it is an easy S tier for me. As for Brave New World, I don't live near a movie theater, and frankly, I don't know if I could give it a proper rating after seeing it in theaters. A lot of these reviews and ratings were only possible because I could pause the movie to take notes. I can't do that in a theater. But if you guys really want me to make a review of Brave New World, I'll make the trip to a movie theater and either make a short or dedicated video out of it. Anyway, that's every single movie in the MCU rated. If you watched every single part, thank you so much. This is by far the longest video I've ever done on this channel, so it really means a lot to me. And if you enjoyed it, maybe consider subscribing as well. It really helps the channel out. I think I've said enough at this point, so I'm just gonna end it here. See ya.